On Primetime Politics, a multi-billion-dollar investment.
And we're delivering a national anchor for Canada's electric vehicle supply chain.
The federal government bets big on electric batteries, committing a reported $13 billion for a Volkswagen plant to be built in St. Thomas, Ontario. Will this secure jobs for the future? Will it have the economic benefits Ottawa is hoping for? We'll speak to our weekend journalist panel about the subject. Also, with the Public Service Alliance on strike, other public unions are joining the pickets and explaining why many federal workers are frustrated with the Trudeau government. Coming up, we'll speak with union leader Jennifer Carr. And the Alberta writ will soon be dropped, but how are things looking for the Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and the provincial NDP leader Rachel Notley? This is Primetime Politics. Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. The federal government is putting a lot of money on the line, a reported $13 billion to help Volkswagen build a new battery plant in St. Thomas, Ontario. It has the potential to be the automaker's biggest gigafactory in the world and could provide tens of thousands of direct and indirect jobs in the years to come. Still, not everyone is convinced of the investment, which the Prime Minister addressed Friday.
Do we want to throw up our hands and say, oh, it's just too tough out there? The world is too complicated. Canada is broken. We're never going to be able to succeed in this. Let's get really mad instead. Sorry, anger doesn't deliver this plant in St. Thomas. Confidence, hard work, optimism, and a willingness to invest in Canadians and in the brightest possible future for all. That's why we're here today, and that's the work we're going to continue doing as a government with our friends and partners to build a better future for all Canadians.
With more on the Volkswagen announcement and the other stories of this past week, we're now joined by Robert Fife, Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail, Tonda MacCharles, the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star, and Catherine Lévesque, parliamentary reporter with the National Post. Good to see all three of you.
Thanks for having us.
Tonda, I'm going to start with you here because it was interesting to see the number of swipes the Prime Minister was making against Pierre Poilievre during the announcement in St. Thomas, Ontario. But Poilievre, criticized by the Prime Minister, in part because Poilievre has been critical about the amount of money put into this plant. Was it necessary to invest the billions of dollars, given the fact that the federal government has already signed battery deals with Stellantis and Ford?
Well, I mean, I think that's going to be the multi-billion-dollar question. Was it necessary? Look, what's interesting also about the fact that they're prepared to throw up to $13 billion at this plant in securing its arrival in Canada is also that it seems to have been a complete change in strategy since even the budget. The government has been telling us that they're not going to do what the U.S. is doing, that they're going to invest at the outset in stimulating production and drawing companies here. Now, all of a sudden, it's many, many more billions than anyone had thought, and at the back end, matching what the U.S. has done. If it does succeed in not just bringing this plant here, but in spawning a whole broader industry, down the road, we'll all look back and say, yes, it was a good investment. But right now, it looks like billions of dollars that people were not advised it was going to be. And I think that the questions being raised about how much transparency we're getting on it are valid questions, and questions this government really doesn't like to answer.
Bob, what do you think? Because again, Pierre Poilievre, I think of just last month, he was on Twitter essentially saying, why is all this money going to a foreign company? Does he have a point, or is he on the wrong side of history?
Well, he does have a point that it's taxpayers' money. How is it being spent? How does it work out? In fact, he wrote today to the Parliamentary Budget Office to say, look, can you provide us with an analysis of this to see if there's value for money out of this, which I think is quite legitimate. Look, I mean, $13 billion for the battery plant, $700 million to build the plant. That works for about 3,000 workers. That's the amount of money going there is 4 times the salary of the employees, which works at like $456,000 per year per employee. Now, if to Tonda's point, if and Volkswagen says this could become the global supplier of electric batteries to Volkswagen, if that is the case, and there's 30,000 or more spin-off jobs in decade time, then we will all be saying, great, good decision. But a lot of these things, there's a history with a lot of those tax incentives. They don't tend to work out. Now, the jury's out, but certainly I think Poilievre has the point to be saying, look, we need transparency. Particularly, if I may, so if those jobs, if there are research and engineering jobs that come there, and not just people assembling batteries, that's real value added, but they haven't said whether that's the case.
Yeah, although it was interesting, Catherine, as we looked at the announcement today, there in and amongst the people speaking to the audience was the local Conservative MP, as was the provincial government, Ontario's government, which is a progressive Conservative government.
And the mayor.
Absolutely, who the Prime Minister noted, better to see you here than in the House of Commons. but all these Conservatives are in the room. Does that present a problem for Pierre Poilievre?
I think so. And I don't think Catherine Lévesque, the MP who was there, had a great time because, Justin Trudeau basically pointed at her and said, see, maybe you should be convincing your own leader, of the importance of these subsidies. So, look, I think it's kind of interesting that, the Prime Minister felt the need to kind of point out the different types of Conservatives, right? Clearly, the person leading the Conservative Party of Canada is a populist. He's kind of going out and talking down on all these investments. And then on the other hand, you have, Doug Ford, progressive Conservative premier, saying, well, look, actually, we want this money. We want these investments, and this is, these are good jobs. So I thought it was interesting that he felt the need to point that out. But I don't think that's necessarily good news for Pierre Poilievre, right? Because, people have just reelected Doug Ford. I think he's doing relatively well. And Pierre Poilievre is definitely not the same type of Conservative as of right now. I would also point out that Catherine Lévesque, also, it put her in an awkward position also because she did not support Pierre Poilievre in the last leadership race. She supported Jean Charest. So Mr. Trudeau really knew what he was doing there. He was kind of pointing out the differences between the different Conservatives.
It just seemed like a bit of a partisan rant, frankly, in a venue and at an event where Conservatives under Doug Ford's government had come together with the Liberal government to produce what the governments are arguing is a great and a unified venture. And then to go on a partisan sort of rant against the federal opposition in Ottawa, I was thinking, are the VW executives, I mean, they're probably counting their billions, but are they rolling their eyes?
Yeah, and Poilievre hasn't said don't give the money. He's just saying, where's the value here? That's
how much per job, and tell us, right?
Well, the Prime Minister might still be stinging, from the question period on Wednesday, because as we talk about the VW plan, I also want to talk about the Prime Minister's trip to Jamaica, because it was Justin Trudeau who was taking it on the chin on Wednesday over that issue, going to Jamaica, staying with family friends, as he describes them, but still wealthy donors to the Trudeau Foundation. So Bob, when you think about the controversy this has caused, what's more problematic here? The fact that this is tied to people who donated to the Trudeau Foundation, or is it the fact that the Prime Minister optically went on this very lavish vacation when most Canadians cannot afford to go on a vacation?
I think it's the latter one. And if you talk to experienced Liberals, they would say to you, I would advise them not to do it. So somebody in the Prime Minister's office, or perhaps his wife Sophie, is saying, I'm going to go, and I don't care what the public thinks, because it does send a message of I'm an elite, I'm very privileged, particularly at a time when economic conditions in the country are not that great. But Trudeau doesn't seem to care. I want my vacations, and I want to party and vacation with very wealthy people, and the rest of you can eat cake.
Well, what do you make of it? Because Tonda, because the Prime Minister does make the argument, it was cleared by the ethics commissioner, although the most recent
use the word cleared, right?
Yeah.
They say we ran it by the ethics commissioner to ensure we were following the rules. And the rules are that if you're a real friend, which he wasn't in the case as it was determined by the ethics office, in the case of the Aga Khan vacation in Barbados, several years ago, in this case they've deemed it, it was a family friend for legit, but still the Prime Minister might have considered the optics and even offered to pay a going Airbnb rate, for example, in order not to be looking like they're taking gifts from wealthy friends. I think it is the Liberals' kryptonite, this stuff, this elitism. It is an easy target for the opposition. And so why does he allow himself to be vulnerable to those attacks? I'm not sure. To Bob's point, I think it's probably true that they just shrug their shoulders and figure he can breeze his way through this. Because, look, he hasn't suffered from more damning allegations back in the blackface scandal. A lot of Canadians essentially didn't run him down for that because they decided he wasn't a racist. Well, by doing this, he is declaring he's rich and he's got rich friends and he's got elite circles to move in. And seemingly, though, he thinks Canadians will shrug that off. To Bob's point about the economic conditions facing most households, will they? We'll see.
Yeah, well, you know, Catherine, the big question is why, as Tonda is saying, because again, if you remind Canadians, it's just not this trip. It was the trip to the Aga Khan's Island. It was also being in Tofino on the first day of Truth and Reconciliation. What is it about this Prime Minister, or perhaps his office, that allows these types of scandals to keep happening?
Well, I mean, essentially, since he's been Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau has had about the same group of advisors, and he's had Katie Telford, you know, who's been there for years and years. And basically, his inner circle has just gotten smaller and smaller, and there aren't as many diverse voices, maybe, or, you know, people from the outside telling him, hey, maybe you shouldn't do that. But I will say in Radio Canada's piece, Radio Canada broke the story this week, you know, there apparently was discussions in the Prime Minister's office, and, you know, some people said, well, maybe we should reconsider, or, you know, it's not clear where the disagreement was exactly. My understanding is it might have been about, you know, should we consult the ethics commissioner or not on this trip. So I think, you know, some Liberals are just getting very, very concerned, increasingly concerned, and we're hearing more and more, you know, people asking the question, as it has been for years, you know, why is Katie Telford still there? Is she, you know, still the right person to be the Prime Minister's chief of staff, because she's so close to Justin Trudeau, and she's, you know, maybe blindsided to all these, you know, different, this narrative that the Prime Minister has ultra-rich friends and maybe, you know, doesn't care about ethics all that much.
I disagree with the fact that it falls to Katie Telford or it falls to Sophie Trudeau. It falls to Justin Trudeau to make the call about what works for him.
Yeah.
And so I think no matter what kind of advice he's getting, good or bad on all of it, really make the call yourself. And if that's the call you're going to make, then you should wear the questions in question period for more than one day, by the way.
At the same time, I mean, each time, you know, he doesn't see it as a problem, though. You know, he says, well, those are family friends. You know, I've went there dozens and dozens of times. I've been friends with them for more than 50 years. So visibly, he doesn't see a problem with what he did. So, you know, he should have, you know, I'm saying, yes, ultimately this is his decision, right? But he should have advisors out there, you know, challenging him and telling him, hey, this is not a good idea, and this is, you know, going to go back to you.
No question. I still think it stops with him, though.
Yeah, it stops with him, except, though, he hasn't really had to pay a price for his past mistakes either. Like, I think it certainly galvanizes.
The narrative begins to add up. When you get into an election campaign, and I can remember Brian Mulroney doing this with Pierre Elliott Trudeau. He put forward a positive vision, and then he went after all the Liberal scandals, and there are a lot of Liberal scandals. And you know, the funny thing about Poilievre, I saw what he put out on the weekend, which was a very inspirational speech talking about ordinary people and how valuable they are and what they make, their contribution to Canada. And you are the people that make this country. And then you say, oh, that's a stump speech that's going to be successful. And then he does these crazy tweets about the CBC and you know, and you go like, what are you doing? Because there is a path to victory for Poilievre, but it's got to be one where there's a positive message. And you can paint the Liberals negative light for a lot of things, but you've got to get off this childish partisan stuff that he seems to be getting involved in. It's like he's not grown up.
I think that what we're saying is that there's competing narratives within. So the Liberals have a competing and challenge to carry a consistent narrative that they care for ordinary Canadians and they understand their financial plight. Poilievre also has a challenge because, you know, while he seems to be going after big issues of importance to Canadians, on that issue, he's playing small ball and nastily, and it's not working to his favor.
Okay, well, my bad news is that we're out of time.
No.
My good news is you are the people that make this panel. So, Bob Fife, Tonda MacCharles, Catherine Lévesque, thank you for the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As the Public Service Alliance of Canada continues its strike, other public service unions are encouraging their own members to show their support and to talk about that and what that means. We're now joined by Jennifer Carr. She is the president of the Professional Institute for the Public Service of Canada. Ms. Carr, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Listen, I think it's worthwhile to lay the groundwork, if you will, for people at home, because while your union does represent public service workers, it is separate from PSAC. Can you explain who your members are?
Yeah, so my members are, we are the second largest federal public service union. We represent 72,000 members across the country. We represent occupations such as engineers, scientists, auditors at the CRA, IT specialists, and healthcare workers.
Mm-hmm. So again, separate from the striking workers right now, although you are calling on your members to show their solidarity, and you're not asking them to strike, but you are asking them to join the picket.
Yeah, so it's, very clearly we are not in a strike position, but we recognize that we are bargaining with the same employer, so it's very important that we show solidarity with our brothers and sisters who are trying to get Treasury Board to come to the table with a fair and reasonable deal.
Mm-hmm. How do your members feel about their employer right now?
So my members are upset. When you have a public service that has worked effectively and efficiently for the last 3 years from a remote from home posturing, to be mandated with no reason and purpose to come back to the office, that hasn't been paid properly for the last 7 years, thanks to
the Phoenix system.
Phoenix pay system. You know, we have highly educated professional people who value their work as a public servant and the work they do on behalf of Canadians. And when it's more important to the government about where you sit versus the productivity that you provide to the government, that's disconcerting.
Mm-hmm. Although, when it comes to the current conflict, or the impasse with PSAC and the Treasury Board, primarily it's about wages. And to hear it from the Treasury Board, they are offering 9% across 3 years. They say that is what they believe is fair. And also, they make the argument if they were actually to give the union what they're asking for, it would make it far more difficult for the federal government to deliver critical services to Canadians.
Yeah, so the first point I'd like to say, the PSAC is coming with a request of 13.5%. And inflation matching the same period is 13.8%. So they're not asking for anything more than to keep their wages stable with what inflation is driving. It's important that people understand that PSAC has been at the table for more than 2 years. We're working backwards. We're getting pay increases for the last 2 years. We're not looking into the future. We're just asking that those wages can keep pace. The cost of groceries, the cost of housing, transportation has all gone up, and those wages need to keep pace.
But again, the Treasury Board is also making the argument that if they met the demand, that would have an impact on public services.
I don't see that as a case. You know, we have enough money coming in to the Treasury Board. My members are actually auditors. They are willing and able to get the revenue that is necessary, not only to pay public service workers what is necessary, but also to pay for social programs that are necessary, dental care, transfers to provinces for health care. But the government doesn't have the resources on site to collect those tax monies.
Mm-hmm. You know, I wonder how you feel, and this is just anecdotal, because I was driving into work listening to talk radio, and certainly of the voices that I was hearing, many people who are not sympathetic, rightly or wrongly, with public service workers, and they find it hard to believe that it is justifiable to walk off a job that is essentially secure, that also comes with good benefits and good pension.
That's very interesting. Like I said, the frustration that we have, there's assumption that we're asking for a lot of things. With the return to work order or mandate, our members are actually struggling to get the basics, like a desk. We want to work productively and effectively on behalf of Canadians. But if we're spending our time looking for desks, looking for proper places to sit, this is taking away from that productivity. So I think they should be more frustrated about the waste that is happening, the logistical nightmare that the government has created, which hinders our ability to deliver those services to Canadians.
Mm-hmm. Now, it was interesting to listen to Mona Fortier as she and other ministers of the government were sitting during the press conference earlier this week, because when she was asked about pay, she said those who went on strike would get strike pay from the union. Those who still continued to work would still get their pay. What did you make of that comment?
It's a very subtle message asking members to break the picket line. I really think that the comment was a kind of a veiled attempt to break solidarity from the line. Again, this government hasn't been able to pay its workers properly for the last 7 years. So one of the reasons members are angry and on the picket line is because they just want to be paid a proper wage that keeps up with inflation so that they can pay their bills.
Quickly losing time here, but given the fact that workers right now are this frustrated with their employer, in this case the federal government, and the federal government has not made any moves as of yet, are you worried about how long this strike might go?
I'm not worried. I really think that because they're still at the table, this is very different from a strike where people walk away from the table. The PSAC is still a willing partner at the table with Treasury Board. We want to make a deal. They are just making sure that Treasury Board understands that its workers are behind them, and my workers are also behind them, because we need to make fair deals that meet inflation, but also are reasonable and have our rights that are secured.
Ms. Carr, thank you for the time.
Thank you.
Well, thanks to Alberta's fixed election date, we know that we're now just 5.5 weeks until voting day, with a writ expected to drop in about 10 days' time. So, to set up what is expected to be a close campaign in Alberta, we're joined right now by political analyst and columnist Graham Thomson. Graham, always good to see you.
Thanks, Michael.
Now, when this year began, pollsters were saying this upcoming vote would be a toss-up. Is that still the case, getting so close to the dropping of the writ?
Yeah, it absolutely is. It's amazing to see an election like this. This is really unheard of in Alberta elections. Normally, we kind of know beforehand who's going to win. And not always. Big surprise in 2015 when the NDP won. But normally, right now, we've got, for the first time, we have a binary electoral system, political system. In Alberta, we've got the NDP and the UCP. The UCP is in government, but the NDP has a really good chance of winning, and the UCP has a really good chance of winning. There's 87 seats up for grabs. You need 44 to form a majority. And there's polls showing the UCP getting 44, 45, 46 seats, a really slim majority. Also, polls can be read so that the NDP gets 44, 45 seats. It could come down to a really narrow, just a few seats, especially in Calgary. We're expecting Calgary to be the battleground. There's 26 seats here. Right now, the NDP only has 3, UCP has 23. But a new poll out by Janet Brown, who did it for the CBC, she's a very well-respected pollster, was talking about the NDP winning maybe 18 seats in Calgary out of those 26. So this election could be a real toss-up, really close to call, unlike elections in the past.
Now, how much of this boils down to Rachel Notley and Danielle Smith? How much of this boils down to the perception of the two leaders?
Yeah, this is an interesting issue because, again, one of the questions on that poll I mentioned with Janet Brown just a matter of days ago was looking at how Calgarians, this is focused on Calgary, how Calgarians view the leaders. And most Calgarians see themselves as centrist on the political scale, not really left or right wing. And they view Notley as being kind of centrist, a little bit left, but centrist like them. And they view Danielle Smith as being way too far right wing. So this is a problem for Smith. In the past, we've seen a number of polls point to people tending to trust and like Rachel Notley, the NDP leader, much more than Danielle Smith, who just became premier, of course, just last year. So there's that trust factor, but also the sense of Calgarians, again, this is going to be the battleground. They see themselves more likely in Rachel Notley, more trust, and they like her better, see her as more like them than they do Danielle Smith. And so the thing is, Danielle Smith is becoming a major issue in this campaign, and not for the better when it comes to the UCP. So yes, likability and trust is going to be a big factor, I think, in this election, dealing with the leaders, not just the policies that they're projecting, but looking more at the leaders. Who do you trust the most? And it seems that Notley has the edge there.
Well, you know, Danielle Smith did issue a paper about reforming the equalization formula, and it makes me wonder, is positioning herself as a defender of Alberta rights, is that a key issue right now? Will that work in her favor?
Yeah, you're right. This is a big issue that UCP has used before. Conservatives have used over the years, fight back against Ottawa, especially when you've got a federal liberal government in play. And so you've got the UCP trying to make this an issue. You got Danielle Smith, of course, the Alberta Sovereignty Act that she brought in last year, fight back against Ottawa. And now you're right, today, releasing a paper looking at equalization, saying it's time to change equalization. Let's have Alberta deal with the other provinces to change equalization. This goes back to referendum in Alberta in 2021, when 60% or so of Albertans wanted to scrap equalization altogether. Of course, a province cannot scrap equalization. It's a federal program funded by federal dollars. But there's that narrative in Alberta politics that Ottawa is robbing us. In fact, Danielle Smith on a campaign trail last year to win the UCP leadership and become premier was talking about Ottawa stealing our money. They're robbing our money, she said. That's a very strong narrative, even though it's not true. It's a very strong narrative. We must fight back against Ottawa. So people want the premier to stand up to Ottawa. They don't like the Sovereignty Act, interestingly enough. So what's going to happen here is that they're putting the Sovereignty Act on the back burner and focusing more on, let's be working with other provinces to try and change equalization. I'm not saying other provinces are particularly in favor of changing equalization, especially those who receive money under the equalization formula. But this is a tactic, an issue that the UCP is raising right now to take the focus away from Danielle Smith and all the controversy surrounding her and focusing it more on what can Alberta do to push back against Ottawa. And that is a common theme in Alberta politics, and it can be very effective and very popular.
Well, we are watching, as we said, just 10 days away from the dropping of the writ. Graham, always good to speak with you. Thank you for the time.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Did the Prime Minister cross the line by vacationing in Jamaica with family friends who are also wealthy donors to the Trudeau Foundation? Now, that's an issue that's been debated by MPs all week, ever since details of the trip were uncovered by Radio-Canada. Now, it has led to some very loud and personal arguments in the Commons, with Conservatives raising issues of access and privilege, and Liberals accusing the opposition of spreading misleading information. Take a look at what happened in the House on Wednesday.
Nobody is raising qualms with the Prime Minister having a vacation. I know it's his favorite thing to do. I had a vacation at the same time. It was a Sunwing package, and I did stay 5 hours waiting at the airport. But that being said, I paid for it myself. We're not asking for the Prime Minister to pay for the security. We're not even asking him to pay for his private jet. We're simply asking him to pay the same price any other family who stayed at that resort would pay, so that he doesn't owe anybody anything. Will he pay back that $80,000?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, these are family friends. My father was godfather to one of their children. Their father was godfather to one of my brothers. Mr. Speaker, these are family friends that we've had for many, many decades, close to 50 years. And over those 50 years, I have been to that vacation spot many, many times with my family, with my father when he was still alive. But of course, Mr. Speaker, we worked with the Ethics Commissioner to make sure all rules were followed, and we followed all the practices in regards to prime ministerial travel, including, unfortunately, having security along with us, which is a requirement for all prime ministers of any party.
Well, to talk about the issue, let's bring in Susan Smith right now. She's principal at Blue Sky Strategy Group. Kate Harrison is vice chair at Summa Strategies, and Kim Wright is principal and founder at Wright Strategies. Hello to the three of you.
Hello.
Susan, I'll get you to start us off here. You know, even if this vacation was nothing more than a trip with friends, the decision, it does open the Prime Minister up to these allegations of buying access, or at the very least being tone deaf to the economic challenges that Canadians are facing. Has the Prime Minister hurt himself with another unforced error?
I think the Prime Minister has a family, and like many Canadians, he works very hard. It's unfortunate that where he goes on a family vacation is public fodder or opposition fodder, I think, for football stuff. Obviously, if the Prime Minister travels anywhere, whether it's Toronto or to Manotick, there's security that is involved. That's the nature of the beast as a Prime Minister of the country. And I think if you want people to step forward and serve in public service, they shouldn't have to spend their time in public service tent camping, unless that's exactly what they want to do. If they don't want to camp in a tent, they don't have to camp in a tent. The Prime Minister has to travel with security. That's what it is. I think the opposition should be barking up other trees at this point. It's just boring.
Mm-hmm. Kate, what do you make of it? Because, you know, we did start this conversation off by playing a bit of the exchange from Pierre Poilievre and the Prime Minister in the House yesterday, and that's because by today, really, Jamaica is no longer really being asked by the opposition, Conservatives included. Is the issue not getting the traction the party wants, or is this still a legitimate issue?
I think because this has been a bit of a pattern of activity for the Prime Minister, this is not the first time that one of his vacations has come under scrutiny. I'm not sure that it does much to necessarily show new voters that Conservatives have something to offer. It's good fodder for the base. If you already think that Justin Trudeau runs in elitist circles and is a little bit out of touch when it comes to his vacation planning, this is another arrow in the quiver as far as that line of attack is concerned. But I think the real issue here, Michael, of course, is timing and the judgment that was applied in taking this vacation at a time when many Canadians are making alternative plans and arrangements. There probably is a middle ground between tent camping, to Susan's reference, and a $9,000 a night luxury resort. So there is a middle ground there that could have been achieved, and had the Prime Minister applied a bit of foresight and been advised that maybe this was not the right time to do something like this, I don't think the opposition would be as perplexed about it as they are right now.
Mm-hmm. Kim, I'm wondering what you think, because as we heard from Susan, really the argument that we hear from the Prime Minister, from Liberals, is that this was a vacation with longtime family friends. It was cleared by the Ethics Department. Was there really anything wrong with this vacation that the Prime Minister took, or is this more vulnerable because of the tie that's being made with the Trudeau Foundation?
I mean, the reality is, I'm not sure that the Prime Minister has taken a holiday that has not resulted in an ethics investigation. Whether we're talking about his trip to Nevis, or we're talking about going to the Aga Khan's private island, or any of the other myriad of other ones, including, God help us, the trip to Tofino, the ill-fated trip to Tofino, where it was on the first of Truth and Reconciliation Days. So we can talk about whether or not he should go on holidays or not. The Prime Minister is entitled to a holiday. He is not, however, entitled to his entitlements, and that's the position we're starting to get into. You couple this with the new, or now former new, ethics czar, who was herself going to be caught up inevitably in potential questions about ethics and conflicts of interest. I mean, the Prime Minister has never seen a conflict of interest he hasn't jumped on. And, you know, we can poo-poo it away a bit, but again, it becomes a pattern. And the only people who are actually bored about this are, you know, this poor staffers who are trying to arrange his holidays that doesn't include him breaking ethics rules. I think at some point he needs not only a travel agent, but a better ethics investigator. This was an unforced error that did not need to happen. And at some point, the Prime Minister will have realized that he has been the Prime Minister since 2015. And hold on, Susan, I know you're going to jump in there and say he's entitled to all of these things. And it's true. He can have a holiday. But at some point, he has got to learn that it doesn't always have to be with his fancy friends at very fancy places. And if he is going to have them, that's fine. But he's going to have to start ponying up for them.
Okay, Susan.
Well,
quickly.
I think, Kim, the one danger is there was an insinuation that there was ethics violations on this particular holiday. That's not the case. And so I think we have to be very careful at the accusations. I think we have to be very careful at those things and making sure you stick to the facts are stuck to on this. Look,
the fact is on every holiday he has taken.
That the average Canadian can afford. There's no
question. I'm not saying he can't take fancy holidays. I'm not saying he can't take fancy holidays, Susan. I can say, however, that politics is something that he should have.
One at a time.
Political leaders need to take a poll about whether or not they can have a vacation with their family. I think that's unreasonable.
I think you can have all the vacations in the world.
Okay, go ahead, Kate.
I think everyone can have all the vacations that they want, but they also have to be realistic, especially somebody who's spent their entire life in politics and under the public spotlight, to understand that there are some points in your life, especially when you've been the prime minister since 2015, that you should recognize that maybe going on fancy holidays and with people who may or may not put you under scrutiny in this climate is not something that he should do, and certainly not something he should be surprised when he's called to account. At what point do we actually do get to call them to account without it being too much of being a partisan hack? Come on now, Suze.
I think, Kate, you want to get in there as well.
Yeah, there's ethics, there's optics, and if you look at the latter, like that's what matters when it comes to re-election. And people are craving political leadership that is in touch with them, that understands their concerns, and kind of reflects that, I think, in their own actions. So again, there probably is a middle ground here between taking a vacation at all and doing what the Prime Minister chose to do, which is a very opulent vacation, again, at a time where people are struggling. And on the public opinion side of things, this is not a good look for a Prime Minister that has had multiple iterations of similar challenges, optical problems in the past. He should have learned his lesson by now, given there's been 4 or 5 of these instances. Okay,
I have 3 minutes, so that's 1 minute to each of you left in this conversation. I really want to quickly talk about that Washington Post story on Canada's defense spending. The Prime Minister would not confirm whether or not he said that comment about the 2% commitment to NATO, but the very fact that this is being reported on, apparently in a leaked document from the Pentagon, is this embarrassing for Canada and for the Prime Minister? Susan, I'll get your thoughts first. You have 1 minute.
I think leaked documents out of the Pentagon are an embarrassment. Leaked documents out of Canada are an embarrassment. And I think the Prime Minister is wise not to comment on the veracity of something like that, whether it's true or not. Then you're validating this kind of thing. There's no doubt that Canada's NATO contributions have never, it's been a long time since they hit the levels that the world wants them to hit. We do our best. Could we spend more? Yes. But it's not a new thing. I think for the government of Canada, this is not a country that likes billions and billions of dollars to go out the door on a regular basis. For defense spending, I think there are times and places where we are supportive of more. I would argue that this is the time and the place, but there's a capacity issue that we have to work up to.
Okay, Kate, you have a minute as well.
Yeah, it's not a good look, certainly, and I think that this particular government feels a lot of pressure when international media starts critiquing their action and behaviors. On this file overall, I don't think it's taking anybody by surprise that we're not going to hit the 2% spending target. But what is more concerning is that there's a pattern here of Canada trying to be all things to all people on the world stage. And that's probably why a number of allies are looking at us with a sense of disappointment. That hasn't necessarily been the case in Ukraine. I think Canada has punched above its weight in terms of supporting Ukraine. Maybe this is more of a comms issue for the government. They need to be a little bit more prescriptive about where they're going to support, maybe have a bit more of a targeted approach, and then that will result in less hurt feelings around the table if we overpromise and underdeliver, which it seems like maybe we are doing in Haiti and Latvia and some of the other nations that have been mentioned in that document.
Kim, your reaction?
So look, I think that there are lots of things that the Prime Minister needs to be aware of, including leaked documents out of the Pentagon. But I also go back to what Jagmeet Singh and the New Democrats have frequently said on military spending, which is that we should be heavily engaged. We should be part of, making sure we're living up to our obligations, both within Canada and our own domestic military, as well as what is required of us around the world, whether that is an arbitrary 2% number from NATO so or not. I think what we really do need to get to the bottom of is what is the appropriate amount that we need to be spending, and maybe it's time we start busting out the credit card on military spending here in Canada, considering what Russia has often been pushing up against on Arctic sovereignty, and certainly what we've seen China do, whether it be weather balloons, influence on elections, or in military increase and pushing. So all of these things, we need to actually have a better response overall on military spending. And I think that is fundamentally where we need to get to if Canada wants to continue to be the respected nation that we have a history of being.
Okay, Susan, Kate, Kim, thank you. You always make my Thursdays very interesting.
Feisty.
Thank you.
Bye, take care.
Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
More than 100,000 federal government workers went on strike Wednesday, making good on their promise to hit the picket line if a tentative deal with Ottawa was not achieved by their deadline. Well, that deadline came and went, and now services right across the country are affected. Passports, tax returns, immigration and visa applications, just to name a few, as workers picket locations right across the country. Well, with her response to the strike now underway by the PSAC, we're joined by Mona Fortier, President of the Treasury Board. Madam Fortier, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we just spoke with the President of the PSAC, and he says this strike is necessary in part because your government has been, and this is his words, dragging its feet in negotiations, only really coming to the table in the last couple of weeks. How do you respond to that?
Well, first, thank you for having me today. And I know Canadians are worried, and I'm here to, of course, make sure that they're confident that we are working at the table, both parties. And I have to say that last year at this time, we tabled our first offer, and PSAC walked out of the table. So 2 weeks ago, we decided to go back in mediation, and we've been working really hard, and I am confident that we will get to a deal, that it will be competitive wages, fair wages for public servants, and also reasonable for Canadians.
Well, I'll talk about wages in a moment, but I do want to continue with some reaction here, because we also heard very quickly out of the gate last night the federal NDP leader, Jagmeet Singh, saying that what we're looking at here is a failure of your government to listen to the concerns of government workers expressed nearly for 2 years now. Why has it come to this point?
Well, again, I have to repeat, last year we did table wages and PSAC chose not to continue the talks, and we got back to the table 2 weeks ago in mediation, and I think that we all have a common purpose here, we all have a common goal, is how best are we going to deliver services to Canadians, and that is what we're working on. That's the common ground that I believe we have. Now, we do have different ideas, and that's where negotiations take place. And we're putting all of our efforts, both parties, all of our efforts to get to a deal.
Now, again, from the union, they're saying when it comes to the discrepancy in terms of wages, what they really are asking for are salaries, wages that reflect the money that they're now paying for groceries, rent, mortgages. Really, at a time when many Canadians are struggling, they say they're no different, and they just want fair wages to reflect their challenges in real life. How do you respond to that?
Well, I respond that there has been a PIC report, what we call the Public Interest Commission, that recommended for a fair wage would be 9%, and that's what we tabled, and that's what we're working on. And this would recognize the work that public servants are doing in their different jobs, and also determine that it would be reasonable for Canadians. Therefore, we are taking that recommendation and putting it forward. And I think that we have to be really confident that we are in a better space economically, as we see the Bank of Canada showing that inflation is going down and 3% looking out very soon. Therefore, we're looking also how those wages can come and continue to support Canadians.
So is it just the wages at this point? Is everything else agreed to, and it's just the wages that remain the sticking point here?
There are different issues. You probably heard one, telework, for example, is something that is being discussed. And of course, I will say that it's a management right from the offset. It's important to know that public servants have the opportunity to work from home 2-3 times a week. the fact that also we're looking at what's happening elsewhere, other jurisdictions, and we're following exactly what's happening across the country. And I think that, you know, telework is a good way to, of course, offer services to Canadians, but we need to make sure that hybrid model is also where people can work together at the same location and manage how best we can serve core services to Canadians.
Core services. In the meantime, we do have roughly 100,000 people leaving the office, joining picket lines right now because of this strike. How will that affect Canadians? What will your government do to try to compensate for the slowdown in work?
So right now, as you know, there are essential services that continue. For example, Child Canada benefit, veterans income supports, AI, all of those services will continue. Other services, of course, will be disrupted. It won't be business as usual. And we'll monitor, of course, how this affects Canadians. But the most important thing is I'm hoping that we can get a deal as soon as possible so we can get back to offering all services to Canadians and be back business as usual.
Mm-hmm. A deal as soon as possible. I hear
Yes.
that. But of course, you also know right now, many are wondering very loudly if this government would use back-to-work legislation if this drags on, I guess, if you deem so, too long. So would your government, even though it talks about workers' rights and also bringing in anti-scab legislation, would your government bring back-to-work legislation as a possibility, or are you going to avoid that?
I'm right now focusing, because we're at the table, to get a deal done at the table. That is where all of my energy is. Even the Prime Minister and I were discussing, and we're putting all of our efforts there, and that's what we'll be doing, negotiating at the table to get to the deal.
Now, where are those negotiations? At this point, you say you're at the table, but are you going to go into the night? Is this something that will go on, or what are you looking at over the next few days?
Well, we've been at the table for 2 weeks, and now, of course, respecting the fact that PSAC decided to go out and strike. The good news is they're still at the table, and we're there working very hard and from morning to night, and we will continue that pattern, hopefully, until we get a deal.
Mona Fortier, it's been a busy day for you. I really appreciate the time. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Workers don't get respect. What do? Shut it down! If we don't get wages that keep up with the cost of living, what do? Shut it down! Shut it!
Well, New Democrats were quick to criticize the federal government, as I said to Mona Fortier, accusing Liberals of dropping the ball after nearly 2 years of negotiations. With more on their thoughts, we're now joined by Alexandre Boulerice, Labour critic and the deputy leader for the NDP. Mr. Boulerice, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Now, your party says the Liberals are the ones who essentially bear responsibility for this strike. Why do you say that?
We say that because, you know, what is on the table right now is really unacceptable and not reasonable. If you look at the inflation and the high costs for everything, including grocery or housing, you know, the Liberals are asking the public servants to get to lose their power to buy necessities in life and to be poorer, in fact, because every year when you're below inflation, you get more poor than you were a little bit before, the year before. And we don't agree with that. I think we need to respect our public servants and public services and be competitive and attractive on the working market. And it's not the case with what the Liberals are offering. So I totally understand the union to be mad and say that our members deserve better, and think that they have a really good point.
So right now, the government, the Treasury Board, is offering 9% across 3 years. The Labour Union, they are asking for, I believe, about 13.5 across that same time period. If you were in government then, if it were the NDP, would you just give that amount to the Public Service Alliance?
Oh, you know, in a negotiation, both sides they need to make compromise, and you don't get everything you ask at the beginning of the negotiation. I'm from the labor movement. I know that you know, on both sides you have to accept things that you were not ready at the beginning of the discussions. But it's the how we do things in Canada, and I think that Liberals should respect that, and I think they need to increase a little bit, because you know, at 3% per year, when the inflation rate is at 7 or 8%, this is not acceptable for, you know, it's tens of thousands of families that will be impacted by that. They have worked really hard in difficult conditions during the pandemic. I think they deserve better and more respect from the Liberals. So we encourage both parties to continue to negotiate and have a good deal for everyone.
Yeah, you say 7-8%, but those are the numbers that we are looking at towards the end of the last year. We heard from Tiff Macklin yesterday, the Bank of Canada governor. He expects interest rates to be down around 3% by the end of this calendar year, down to 2% by the beginning of next. Is it fair then that the Treasury Board is saying, look, if you look at where this is headed, inflation will get more under control and more in line with what's being offered?
But we want to be very clear about something, is that their collective agreement ended 2 years ago. So we have to take in consideration those 2 years where they didn't get any hike or increase in their revenue and salary. And those 3 years of the proposition on the table right now, the first 2 years are included in those 3 years. So we cannot just say, oh, it's going to be better next spring or next year, because we are looking in the past mostly right now.
Well, you know, it was interesting to hear from the Treasury Board, because they make the argument that if they actually give unions what they want, that would actually end up having a negative effect on the kinds of services the government could deliver to Canadians. How do you respond to that?
I would say quite the opposite, because the fact that they are not, the public servants' working conditions are not competitive on the market right now, makes it very difficult to retain people at their jobs. And we see a big shift in employees. It has consequences on the quality of services that Canadians and citizens will receive. Let's get an example on EI. I was talking with president of a local union. The vast majority of her members are there since the last 18 months. So if you look at the training, formation, experience, the capacity to make the good decisions, it has already had an impact on the quality of services. So, you know, I'm not saying give everything that the union is asking for, but there's a real consequences on the citizens if their working conditions are not good enough and they have to train new employees all the time. It makes no sense.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's already known that your party will never support back-to-work legislation if it should come to that. No one said that it will quite yet, but are you worried about that possibility?
We are really worried, because we all know that back-to-work legislation, or even, you know, the threat or the possibility of a back-to-work legislation, you know, make that, you know, the Treasury Board have no incentive to negotiate in good faith, because they can sit down and wait for the bill and wait for the back-to-work legislation, so it breaks the balance at the negotiation table. And we at the NDP, we believe in the rights, fundamental rights of workers, and also the freedom to exercise pressure tactics and to have a free negotiation process. And back-to-work legislation is always only on one side, and it's always against the workers. So we urge Liberals not to do it, and if they do it, we'll never vote in favor.
Alexandre Boulerice, thank you very much for the time.
Yeah, my pleasure.
On Wednesday, more than 100,000 workers with the Public Service Alliance of Canada walked off the job, going on strike after the federal government failed to reach a tentative deal with the public sector union. To talk about that, in particular with a look to the week ahead, let's bring back our weekend journalist panel. Robert Fife is the Ottawa Bureau Chief with the Globe and Mail, Tonda MacCharles is the Ottawa Bureau Chief with the Toronto Star, and Catherine Lévesque is parliamentary reporter with the National Post. You know, Bob, the strike is obviously affecting federal services right across the country, and you know, the government says they want this to be solved and negotiated at the table, but how long can this really go on before they have to consider some kind of back-to-work legislation?
Well, I don't think they want to have back-to-work legislation if they possibly can. I'm not sure they'd even get it through the House of Commons. I'm not sure that the Conservatives or the Bloc. Certainly the NDP would not support it. I'm not sure the Conservatives would. I mean, their whole object is a broken country, right? So why help them? But it certainly can't last that long. I don't think there's a lot of sympathy out there for public servants. That's a pretty good wage package that's on the table, better than most people would have. You know, this idea that they want to continue to work at home is something that I don't think is going to be very popular with people out there, because most people have to go back to work. So it's a gamble for the unions, and I don't even think there's a lot of support, frankly, within the union. They only got, I think it was 30% of their 35%
showed up to vote, and then only 80 of that voted for a strike. So
you know, so I think probably. Reporters who've been out talking to people on the picket line keep saying that a lot of these people, they don't want to be quoted, but are saying, and we thought the wage package was pretty good.
Yeah. It's interesting because I was listening to talk radio driving it, and there more than one public servant. You know, they're self-identifying. You can't verify, but they said they would have taken the increase being offered. But you know, go ahead.
I mean, another factor in how long you ask how long will this go on? I mean, there's a couple of big factors to what extent the government is willing to tolerate it. But from the Public Service Alliance of Canada's perspective, they only had a $43 million strike fund. So if you're paying workers, 110,000 workers, $75 a day to stay out on strike, that fund's going to last you a week. So then what do? Do they go to the banks? Do they try to finance a longer strike? I think the pressure will build not just on the union and the union leaders to come back with some other kind of reasonable dealing with the government, but to the same extent, you know, you can't underestimate, there's also pressure on the Liberal government. Economists are saying that a prolonged strike will actually hit GDP in this country, you know, at least in the short term, and will impact the risk of a recession. So this government can't really afford it. Its margins are very tight. Its fiscal projections are very tight. And it doesn't have a lot of room to maneuver either, even if it manages to persuade, say, the Conservatives to support something. So I think there's pressure on all parties in all of this. There's a lot on the line. And, you know, we're only a few days into it, but, you know, in the coming days and weeks, if it goes on for any length of time and services are really impacted, then there's going to be a huge cost to pay to catch up on all the backlogs. So it's a big deal.
So what are you watching out for then, Catherine?
I think I'm watching to see how many days this is going to go on for, right? Because as of right now, we're only on day 3 at the time where we're speaking, but the government doesn't seem too concerned. I mean, certainly, I think where the problem is certainly the enshrining the possibility of working from home in the collective agreement. I think that's really the problem as of right now. That would also create a huge precedent for any workplace. But I think, I'm going to see if this goes on for another week. And, like Tonda said, I'm not sure this can go on so long. I mean, certainly, PSAC said that they can use other funds. I think other unions are also ready to jump in to actually provide that $75 per day for the strikers. But, I think a lot of strikers are not very happy about what's going on. I mean, they don't really know at this moment, whether they're getting paid or if this is going to be, their pay is going to be clawed back. And we know all the problems with Phoenix right now. I mean, certainly this is going to be a mess for their paychecks too. And on the other side, I mean, certainly, the government, did tell us that if this just lasts a few days, they could maybe all the backlogs for the passports and all the other services, they could maybe find a way to get through that and in a timely fashion. But certainly if it goes on for more than a week, I mean, I think we're going to see some other sob stories and some other people lining up at the passport offices. And I don't think the federal government wants to see that. They
may not give on the wage offer, but they might give on the remote work stuff, right? That might be actually someplace where the government is willing to give a little bit longer of an extension and allow public servants to work from home longer. Will that cost them ultimately in service delivery? Who knows? Public servants did deliver services remotely for 3 years. So why is that a pressure point right now? The government hasn't explained that, but I see that's where the wiggle room is.
But on that whole issue, and I was speaking to a senior government official who was saying, look, what we're concerned about is giving up management control to the unions if we give in on working at home. So there may be some deal, but they want to be able to be the managers to say, you have to work here or you have to work here. I mean, their concern is, for example, somebody in Toronto wants to apply for a job in Montreal but work in Toronto. I mean, that's kind of stuff that they're concerned about. The management has to be able to decide hours and flexibility and all that sort of stuff, not the union. So we'll see.
Well, we are certainly watching as the week goes on. But for now, thank you very much for the time. Bob, Tonda, and Catherine, always a pleasure.
Thank you.
And that is our program for this weekend. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. We'll see you in Primetime Politics next time.